Today, we're talking with Tempdrop about how to inform and improve fertility treatment through ovulation tracking. And when we had this conversation about what to talk about today, I was absolutely amazed about how ovulation tracking can give you so much information pre-treatment and also for treatment and for improving success rates. I had no idea. And so it's wonderful that you're all here today because you're about to learn a lot. So can you just tell us a little bit more about you before we start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and obviously a Tempdrop team member. Personally, I discovered fertility awareness a few years ago, and it just made such a massive impact on my life, on my overall health, as well as mental health, that it's just moved me to want to share it as much as possible. It's something I talk about a lot wherever I go, drive people crazy. So I'm really passionate about spreading that word. And when Tempdrop came out, when it was launched, I was one of the first to receive a Tempdrop and ended up now working for the company. So it's a pretty amazing company, and it's wonderful to be able to work in this field and be able to have this opportunity to spread the word to as many women as possible. And I work remotely from here in Australia.
Great. And Gemma, who's from the public relations person at Tempdrop, a little bit about you, please, Gemma.
Yeah, sure. So it was actually Mel that introduced me to the benefits of charting. As she said, she likes to talk to people about the benefits of it. So I started charting 2 years ago with Tempdrop, and then was fortunate enough to join Tempdrop as a team member a year ago. So yeah, as Mel said, it's a wonderful company to work with. Just so interesting as well, like to see all the health insights and data that you can gain about your own fertility and your own health, which we'll talk about today as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for both joining us. So tell us a bit about Tempdrop.
Sure. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about Tempdrop, but I think the way that Tempdrop came to be is really relatable for many couples that would be joining today. Because essentially, Tempdrop was born out of difficulties conceiving a baby. And I'm sure that for many of you, you've had similar conversations with your doctor that founder and CEO Michael Vardy had with his doctor, whereby you go to them and you explain that it's taken us longer than we expected to get pregnant. And the doctor pulls out the menstrual cycle wheel and explains that you have a 28-day cycle and ovulation happens on day 14, and tells you just need to time intercourse around cycle day 14 and you'll get pregnant. And it seems so simple, but we know in fact that it really isn't that simple. In fact, studies have shown that a very small percentage of women actually do ovulate on the 14th day of their cycle, and that's even if they do appear to have regular 28-day cycles. So for Michael and his wife, they didn't just accept that advice. They did more research about cycle tracking and then really looked to technology as a potential resource to help them get pregnant. At the time, he used the charting app Overview, which is now part of Tempdrop, coincidentally, to track his wife's cycle and to be able to identify when ovulation was actually happening. And long story short, they were able to get pregnant not once, but twice using that method. But then obviously seeing that this was a challenge for many women, with Michael's background of engineering in the medical devices industry, he was able to develop a wearable sensor that would track basal body temperature accurately, but without the strict and more difficult rules that usually surround that, so that more women could identify when they were ovulating. We know that trying to conceive can be stressful enough without having to worry about all the rules. So this was really about creating something that enabled more women to track their cycle, but with the least amount of effort. And with the charting app integration now as well, with the predictions and interpretations, it's been made much more simple. So our goal at Tempdrop is obviously to make it a bit easier, but also to give more couples clear data and insights about their own body. And that's what we're going to explore a bit more today. Data and insights that enable you to feel so much more empowered, enough to be able to advocate for yourself when you're in the doctor's office, whether that's with your GP, with your fertility specialist, or another practitioner that you're using to improve your fertility, so that you feel able to say to your doctor, actually, I know I don't ovulate on day 14. I'm ovulating on day 25 of my cycle. And so if you're trying to test my progesterone on day 21, that's not going to be accurate. That's not going to help me at all. Or I'm not really feeling comfortable with this treatment route, and here's the reasons why. Here's the data to prove it. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. And Mel's going to explain some case studies and really explore that in more detail. So I'll hand over to Mel to do that.
Could I just ask you quickly, because I think that a lot of people assume that ovulation tracking is for people who are trying to conceive naturally, but obviously there's a huge part of it that coincides with fertility treatment and specialist care, isn't there? And so that's what you're going to cover as well as natural conception today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so diving right in, ovulation tracking, what is it? If you've never explored this before. So just in this slide now, we've got a demonstration of a chart that has the data from cycle tracking. So it's daily observing and charting your fertility biomarkers. Throughout the cycle, our biomarkers change under the influence of the two dominant hormones, as shown on this chart here, estrogen and progesterone. Before ovulation, estrogen rises and comes up to a peak. And then after ovulation is when progesterone is produced by the ovary. So it's these two hormones that have an effect on our biomarkers, or as we commonly call them, our fertility symptoms. Now, especially we want to focus in firstly on a nightly sleeping temperature, or it's commonly known as a basal body temperature. This is a reliable symptom that you can use at home to validate if ovulation is happening and when you're ovulating. On our chart here, it's shown with those black dots. So that's each and every day you get a nightly sleeping temperature, put it on a chart, and you can see here that after ovulation, the body temperature rises. It's not a great big rise, but by putting a sleeping temperature on a chart every day, you'll be able to detect that subtle rise. And it's progesterone that causes the body temperature to jump or to rise. So after you ovulate, progesterone starts to be produced, and then that effect on the body is to raise the body temperature. So tracking temperatures every day helps you to be able to confirm ovulation, and studies have proven it's reliable. Now, of course, ovulation determines the fertile window. This is the time that you can conceive. The fertile window actually runs for a few days before ovulation. The reason for that is because sperm can survive in the reproductive tract for up to 5 days in most ideal conditions. But, those couple of days before ovulation is also a very fertile time. So by tracking your symptoms, you'll be able to increase your chances of narrowing down that fertile window and ovulation. The other thing that temperatures can help you with is to be able to monitor the length of your luteal phase. The luteal phase is the time from ovulation through to the end of the cycle. And on our chart demonstrated here, you can see those numbers. That is the length of your luteal phase. And you might learn as you dig deeper that a short luteal phase can be consistent with low progesterone. And if it's not long enough, you won't be able to sustain a pregnancy. So monitoring a luteal phase is a very important part of the TTC journey, and understanding what your body is doing. And temperature tracking will allow you to do that as well. So there's other symptoms as well, though, that we can track. If we move through, there's more that we can do beside temperatures alone. Another important symptom, if you possibly can track it, it can be a little bit more difficult for some women, or a bit more difficult at the beginning maybe, being able to identify the changes, but in cervical mucus or cervical fluid. Because cervical fluid, as shown on the chart here in the grey and green bars, actually increases in quantity, and it changes in the way it looks, the texture, the consistency in the lead up to ovulation. So if you become adept at tracking that daily, you'll be able to notice that subtle change as well. And that's a really good biomarker to help you open your fertile window, or to identify that ovulation is approaching through cervical mucus. Another common symptom or biomarker, we'll just pop back, is ovulation predictor kits. These are probably more well known. LH test strips is another way. So this is checking the luteinizing hormone in your urine. Now this chart, the blue line, is demonstrating how luteinizing hormone changes over the course of the cycle. It really surges and spikes just before ovulation, and it's the hormone that helps to trigger ovulation, or try to trigger ovulation. So if you add that as another symptom, if it's one that you want to track, you can also put that on your chart, and it too will give you an indication of when ovulation might occur, because generally ovulation should occur in the 12 to 36 hours after LH surges. And so you pick that positive up on the LH test strip, and now you're in a good position to know, okay, it's very, very likely I'm going to ovulate in the next day or two, so it's a good time to take advantage of timing your intercourse. Another secondary symptom that some women do track as well is cervical position and the texture of their cervix. That also changes over the course of the cycle. So there's lots of symptoms that women can track each and every day. There's even more than what we've listed here. But two of the primary symptoms are BBT, the temperatures, and cervical mucus. So even if you can just concentrate on those two, you will be able to discover so much about your cycle. But then, we might wonder, why can't we just period track? Isn't period tracking enough to be able to identify that we're ovulating successfully, that our cycles are regular or irregular? Well, if we take a look at the next slide, we'll be able to, going back one, I've missed one here. Irregular cycles. Sorry, that's a question that comes up, because obviously this chart we're looking at here is a very regular cycle. It's 26 days long. It's very, typical of someone who has very regular cycles. So if you have irregular cycles, can ovulation tracking still help you? So if we take a look at the next slide, we can see that yes, it can. Now, obviously, this is a very different looking cycle. It's much longer. It's 44 days long. But even with that long irregular cycle, the temperature change is obvious. You can still see that temperature jump. You can also see a change in cervical mucus here as well. So these symptoms will still help you to confirm when you ovulate, even if it's much later than the typical regular cycles. So it's very beneficial, even if your cycles are a little bit all over the place. It's actually ovulation that dictates how long your cycle will be. It's ovulation that moves, not your period. The period always comes at around 2 weeks after ovulation. So if you can identify ovulation and when it's happening, you'll now have an idea of how long your cycle is going to be, but you will be able to see it when you're cycle tracking this way. So then, why not just track periods then? Isn't that good enough? Or is ovulation tracking or cycle charting the same as period tracking? Well, no, it's not. So if we take a look, this is why we can say that. So firstly, we just want to reiterate or say that not all bleeding is a true menstrual period, and this is a very important thing to learn when we're trying to conceive, or even if we're not trying to conceive. It's part of learning what a healthy cycle should look like. So a true menstrual period, the shedding of the lining, the uterine lining, a healthy uterine lining, is the bleeding that follows after ovulation. Around 2 weeks after ovulation, you can expect your menstrual period, true menstrual bleeding. There's other bleeding that can occur though, and this is known as intermenstrual bleeding. So we might have a few days of bleeding between menstruation and ovulation. So in that in-between time, that's not a true menstrual period. That's commonly known as a withdrawal bleed or a breakthrough bleed, but it can confuse because it's not indicating the start of a new cycle. Ovulation is the event in the cycle that dictates when a cycle is complete, not the bleeding. So if you're just tracking your period, you might be actually, not tracking true cycles. Now, just to demonstrate this, we've got a little case study we're going to have a look at, just to how important this really is. So if we take a look at Alicia's story. So Alicia has been trying to conceive for quite some time. Sadly, she has suffered some miscarriages, but she decided that she was heading towards the road of needing to seek help from a fertility specialist or a doctor. And so while she was waiting for that, because as we know, it can take quite some time before we can get there, she decided to start tracking her period, just the bleeding events. And she recorded them. She shared them with us here. You can see that it actually looks pretty normal. I mean, variations there, 30-day cycle, 29, 30. She did have, during this time, a chemical pregnancy because she got a light positive, but then bled a few days later. And her period length looks pretty normal. So if she was just writing down these stats, it looks all pretty regular. But then she heard about Tempdrop. She bought a Tempdrop and she started to add temperatures to her tracking. And now we can see what this revealed. So Alicia, these bleeds that she was having were not all start of a new cycle. We can see on this chart, notice the little patches of the pink bars, those are her bleeding patterns. But you can see from the temperatures, from what we looked at before with a normal cycle, she wasn't ovulating. She never actually ovulated until right up at around about cycle day 96. But she still had these bleeding events. So it's just such a good example of why it's important to be able to distinguish between intermenstrual bleeding and actual real periods. This is going to play a massive role in hormone testing for one. I think Gemma already mentioned that often when you go and seek fertility treatments, the first thing they will do is hormone testing, and they would like to test estrogen on cycle day 3 normally, and then progesterone is often tested on cycle day 21. Now that's based on that medical model that all women have a 28-day cycle. They're trying to find the progesterone levels after you've ovulated, and the assumption is that you will ovulate on day 14, so a week later we'll test. Well, if this had been the case with Alicia, obviously if she got tested way back there on day 14, they would say, oh, you haven't ovulated, something's wrong there, or your progesterone levels are non-existent. But she didn't actually ovulate till way up there around day 96. Now, Alicia was ready for this because by this time she had learnt enough to know, okay, I haven't ovulated yet. And when she did actually ovulate, when she saw those temperatures spike and they stayed elevated for a couple of days, she now went in and had her blood draw. She waited 7 days after her temperatures rose and went in and had the blood draw to test her progesterone, and it came back wonderful. It confirmed ovulation and it was at a healthy level. So, for Alicia, just having this one extra symptom, she did track a little bit of CM, but not too much, but having this one extra symptom on a chart, as well as this bleeding patterns, she now had so much more information ready to be able to go to her fertility specialist. Now she could say, instead of giving this list of going, look, I'm having regular cycles, she could say, well, actually, I'm having all these irregular bleeds and I'm having very long cycles. So that's why it's so valuable to be able to just add, even one symptom, if that's all you can do. But then we've mentioned OPKs or LH test strips, and many women use these only. They just use those to try and determine when they're ovulating. Now, as we mentioned, these test strips detect a rise in luteinizing hormone. Now, luteinizing hormone is essential to ovulate, but it doesn't guarantee that you will ovulate. There is a chance that the follicle won't rupture and ovulation won't be successful. And in women with hormonal conditions such as PCOS, they commonly have high LH, higher than normal. So if they're using these test strips, they can get a lot of false positives, as it were, because the levels are just naturally high for them and the test strips are going to pick that up. In this example chart here, we can see how she's used the test strips, and she received a positive around cycle day 14, 15, and she's probably thinking, okay, great, I'm going to ovulate. But her temperatures don't validate that it was successful. They stayed low. And so now she would know, look, I haven't ovulated. I'm still in my follicular phase. I've got to now watch for my next fertile phase. And then that's happened there on day 29. She's got another positive test. This time it's combined with some peak type CM. So she's got a secondary sign. And then the temperatures have validated that ovulation attempt was successful. Now, this is super important if you need progesterone supplementation. So if you are someone who's gone to a fertility doctor, they've tested your progesterone, they've worked out that it's too low, and they've given you progesterone to take after you ovulate. If you were to rely on LH strips alone, you might start taking it too early. If you take progesterone before you ovulate, it'll actually suppress ovulation. It'll kind of mess up that whole cycle for you. So by adding temperatures here and watching and waiting, you'll be able to validate, look, this ovulation attempt was successful. I now know it's the right time to take my progesterone. And you can take that for the number of days prescribed. And hopefully that will do what it needs to do to help a successful pregnancy. So yeah, LH test strips on their own are just, for many women, yes, they work, but it's not a confirmation that your ovulation attempt is successful. So adding another symptom, BBT at the minimum, is going to help you be able to cross-check that. So these are just, this is very simple. This is quick. I'm not going into too much detail. There is so much you can learn from charting your cycles. You can learn to monitor your hormone levels, all sorts of things. But these are just some of the basics. And some of the things that we can gather, as we've learned, is firstly, if we are ovulating, and then when we're ovulating. So am I having irregular cycles? Where in my cycle am I generally ovulating? You can confirm if your bleeding patterns are real periods starting a new cycle, or if they're intermenstrual bleeding and it's not a new cycle at all. You can understand if you're having, LH surges, are your LH levels high but you're not successfully ovulating? The BBT patterns, the temperature patterns can tell you a lot. If they're stable, if they're really erratic, it can tell you a lot about your hormone fluctuations. And you can monitor your luteal phase length. So before you even approach your specialist, your fertility doctor, whoever you're seeking help with, you can have the information to go, look, my luteal phase is not a good length. It's not long enough to sustain a pregnancy. So that can then prompt them to look at progesterone testing very early in your treatment rather than waiting. And also you'll be able to monitor your mucus types. If you'll be able to see whether you have good quality peak type mucus, which is also a vital part of keeping sperm alive, filtering sperm, and increasing your chances of conception. So there are just a few of the things that you can gather ready, even for yourself, to be able to increase your chances naturally, or if you have to go on to fertility treatments, it's all information you'll be ready with. And how can this help in the next step? Well, obviously, if you are approaching a medical provider, you can talk to them in an informed manner. And that's huge. I mean, there's nothing worse than the feeling of having no idea, or just that feeling of helplessness that you don't understand what is going on in your body. But with this information, you can. And when you approach them, you'll be able to speak in an informed manner. You'll be able to narrow down your fertile window accurately. So then you'll be able to convey that to your health provider that, look, I know my timing is good and I've done so many cycles, you know, whether it be 6, 12 already, that I know I'm hitting my fertile window. You can plan the hormone testing on the correct days. Remember Alicia's story, she held on to her paperwork to go and get her blood draw until she knew she ovulated. And that way she wasn't wasting that. And it can be costly if you're paying for that yourself. So you've got the ability to be able to plan your hormone testing. You've got the ability to take, know when you've got to take your medication such as progesterone. And even if you're going for IUI or IVF, this still plays out in the same manner. So even though you're receiving fertility drugs to, kind of time your body or force your body to ovulate at certain times, you're going to still see that reflected on your charts. So it's not, it's not something that's not valuable if you're going down this road. You'll still be able to see the temperature rise, and that will help you understand your timing better. So yeah, there's just so many reasons why it's worth doing this. It empowers you, it gives you the knowledge you need, and it helps you to be able to, and your healthcare provider, to be able to plan your fertility treatments in the way that you're going to maximize everything that you do, and you'll be able to see if it's working for you, if it needs tweaking, whatever the case might be. Now, this all sounds good, but of course the next question comes up is, how am I going to do this? To take a temperature every day, to learn how to track my mucus.
And then someone had asked, obviously, to learn more about Tempdrop and how they can use it to their full potential. I'm putting the contact details here so people can get in touch with you and look to order one. We've also got a code, which I'm just going to read out now. If you want to get 10% off, you can through code FHHTD10. So there's the code if you want to try it. I'm just going to loop back to this page so you can have a look at Tempdrop's website, message them if you've got any questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking the questions here, Gemma and Mel will be very happy to take your questions on a more personal level, so please don't hesitate to ask them.